Good evening, everybody. It's my opportunity just to welcome you to the Westminster Abbey Institute, and that seeks to nurture and revitalise moral and spiritual values in public life. So that's a simple but profound idea behind this evening. You should have seen the biographies of myself, but particularly the speaker here tonight. But I thought I'd just bring out just a few points in Claire Foster-Gilbert's background, which may be particularly relevant for tonight. She said that I shouldn't do this, but I thought we ought to just highlight some things that are really pertinent. Claire read theology at Balliol College, Oxford, developed expertise in medical ethics as a research fellow at King's College in London, became a national expert in research ethics committees, worked with the Department of Health to create a comprehensive network of ethics committees, became a policy advisor in medical ethics and environmental issues for the Archbishop's Council, became a lay canon at St. Paul's. In 2008, founded the Ethics Academy charity, and that's a programme teaching moral strength and courage to young people and adults through the story of the hero's journey. In 2012, returned to Westminster Abbey as founder director of the Institute, has been a member or chair of numerous public and advisory bodies, including the Banking Code Standards Board, the Royal College of Paediatrics Ethics Committee, and more recently, the British Medical Association's Medical Ethics Committee. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Claire to speak this evening. Thank you.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, a novice monk was sent to the library of his monastery to learn the art of manuscript copying from the senior monks. He sat industriously at his carrel, trying to form the letters as beautifully as those he was copying. His script was the law of his monastery, and he couldn't help noticing that the manuscript from which he was working was itself a copy. He asked the abbot with some trepidation if it might not be the case that the copies from which the monks were copying might contain some mistakes, which would then be perpetuated. The abbot thought he had a point and disappeared off to the dark dungeons of the abbey to find the originals. He was gone for hours and was eventually discovered, covered in dungeon dust, clutching a manuscript in floods of tears. "It doesn't say celibate," he said. "It says celebrate." In 1912, Cuthbert Butler, a real monk who became abbot of Downside, discovered that for 1,000 years, Benedictine monks had been faithfully and wrongly copying a phrase in the Rule of St. Benedict, the phrase that is translated into English as conversion of manners, the title of my lecture tonight. Conversio moro was in fact conversatio moro. Unlike the difference between celibate and celebrate, however, the distinction between the two Latin forms was not clear. Indeed, the phrase, whether conversio or conversatio, is not clear, and debate amongst scholars as to what Benedict might have meant continues. The phrase conversion of manners is the rough translation of the third of the three vows Benedictines make, the first two being stability and obedience. The vows are found in the Rule of St. Benedict, which dates back to the 5th century. Benedict's rule and the form of monasticism that it founded signified a change in the way the religious life was led. Hitherto, it had centered upon following one holy and charismatic person into the desert. Now, communities were created who, together, placed themselves under a rule of life. But the core monastic virtue was not lost. Inspired by the practice of Christ himself, who withdrew regularly to barren places to pray, the monk or nun made the choice to enter the metaphorical desert. For Irish monks, the desert was the sea, and their little coracles washed up on the unforgiving rocky shores of the Skellig Islands. Others simply left the city. Still others located themselves in the heart of the city. To enter the desert was to renounce the addictions that make up a human life and to throw oneself at the mercy of God to provide. The extremism this engendered in some earnest religious souls, such as the lonely ascetics on Skellig St. Michael, was tempered by Benedict's rule of moderation, which allowed a little wine and some sensible husbandry into the desert community. And this has stood the test of time, contributing in no small manner, and somewhat ironically, to the wealth of Western Europe. There are thriving Benedictine communities today, and although numbers are down, there is some evidence of a revival of interest in entering the desert. The vow, conversatio moro, can be understood thus. The Latin word conversatio carries the sense of change or turn with, and moro is the basis of the word mores, our morals, our social norms and customs, those ideas and perceptions from which our behaviour springs. The monks of the Community of the Resurrection at Mirfield, an Anglican order following the Benedictine rule, say they understand their vow of conversion of morals to be one of turning again towards God, choosing the metaphorical desert every day. Mark Patrick Hedderman, Benedictine Abbot of Glenstall in Limerick, writes that the vow can be experienced as undergoing a cultural conversion, surrendering the addictive ideas or mores which govern our behaviour in order to become what God wants us to be. The metaphorical desert is a place of not owning anything, including knowledge. This evening, I will explore the vow conversion of manners, a vow that has been life-giving to Benedictine communities for 15 centuries. I will consider it as a virtue that is relevant to the communities of public servants who operate around this Benedictine foundation of Westminster Abbey, with the hope that, as my esteemed colleagues Vernon and Andrew so successfully demonstrated in their lectures on stability and community, it might be of some use. My method, drawn from that brilliant 20th century philosopher Paul Ricoeur, is this. If we have an ancient concept that has remained meaningful and regenerative to communities of people for a very long time, then it is worth asking it to offer meaning and regeneration to our situation today. What I want to do with you this evening is not to delve deeply into the past for understanding, but to delve deeply into our needy present for questions that the concept might help to answer. Conversion of manners, however understood, has passed the test of time, so I want it to work hard to serve the tests of our time. Specifically, I want to bring it to the question that fundamentally underlies the work of the people and institutions around Parliament Square, which is, what good should we be trying to do? How does conversion of manners help answer the question, what good should we be trying to do? Conversion of manners, with its sense of daily retuning or returning, implies that goodness is not binary. The retuning or returning to the good that we seek means both facing the complexities and contradictions that arise in context, and also taking steps to protect ourselves against the pressures that corrupt, corrode, and confound our seeking and staying with the good. Christianity, in common with other faiths, has an understanding of conversion as a second birth, experienced as a moment of decision after which nothing is the same. I still remember the slightly queasy feeling I had when a former Bishop of Liverpool fixed me with a gimlet eye over breakfast at the Athenaeum and asked me when I became a Christian. And I really knew that when I was christened as a baby was the wrong answer. We were meant to be discussing environmental issues, so it seemed rather irrelevant and frankly impertinent, especially at breakfast, to be asked such a question. What I should have said was, I'm still becoming one. The first conversion is the enemy of the second, Bishop, because when you convert, you think you've found the truth, and that blinds you to further truth and understanding. What, though, might conversion look like outside the specifically religious sphere? There are times in our lives, in the lives of our communities, our workplaces, and society more generally, when new realizations dawn and things change. The biggest changes happen when there is a paradigm shift, and this might be thought of as the ultimate conversion of manners. A paradigm shift comes about because of a discovery that looks like nothing we have seen before. It requires an openness to seeing completely new possibilities and a willingness to try new ways of making them happen. The story of penicillin is a good example. Alexander Fleming took 10 years to understand the implications of the mold he saw growing in a petri dish in his laboratory, because he was certain, as everyone was at the time, that infection could not be treated systemically, but only topically, if at all. The possibility that one might swallow a tablet and that this would deal with infection anywhere in the body was simply not present in his mind, so he didn't see it. Once he did, and once, crucially, the multidisciplinary team had been brought together to create the medicine, everything changed. But notice, 60 years on, how serious the problem now is of overuse of antibiotics. We have inherited the paradigm that you can treat infection with a pill, and the pharmaceutical industry has enjoyed half a century's golden age predicated on that belief. Now we are failing to understand that we may not, after all, be able to treat infection with a pill if the infection is a bacteria that has subsequently learned to circumvent the properties of the pill. All the time we fail to see that, we continue to take antibiotics because it always used to work, we think, so why shouldn't it still? Lives are endangered by our drug-taking habit, as overuse of antibiotics increases the number of superbugs and infection can no longer be treated. Pharmaceuticals are not the magical bullets we once thought, with good reason they were. The first conversion, paradigm shift, is the enemy of the second. A similar trajectory can be seen in our perception of and beliefs about energy sources. The capacity of coal and oil for producing energy was discovered. Ways were found to harness the energy, and a paradigm shift ensued in the form of the Industrial Revolution with all its immense benefits. And now, as we know, its immense disbenefits to the atmosphere. Today, the addiction to that way of seeing, that way of living, is preventing the next paradigm shift into resourcing energy needs in a less harmful way. And so with change within ourselves. We are heading in one direction, light dawns that it is the wrong direction, and we head with enthusiasm in a different direction, unable or unwilling to listen for contradictory voices, wrapped in the zeal of our own certainty. And perhaps if the shift in our belief system is profound enough and countercultural enough, we have to be focused and single-minded for a bit. But woe betide us, especially leaders, if we don't start to pay attention to disagreement. It is especially important for leaders because human beings are a susceptible bunch, and we rather like having someone who tells us with great certainty what we should believe. We can heave the responsibility onto that person, give him the glory if he wants it, which he usually does, and also the blame when it all goes wrong. We, meanwhile, were only obeying orders. Jeffrey Sachs writes that J.F. Kennedy employed somebody whose sole task was to disagree with him. JFK had a personal devil's advocate because he recognized that once you reach a certain level of seniority, you will be surrounded by yay-sayers. The professor, judge, bishop, director general in the civil service, general in the army, dean, chief constable, deliberately or inadvertently switch their tuner buttons permanently to transmit. And it never goes back to receive unless it is intentionally retuned. No one is going to ask you to do that. You have to know you must do it yourself. That is why, incidentally, the Institute's Fellows Programme enrolls public servants at the level just below this, in order to prepare them to listen for disagreement when no one will be asking them to. It is the idea behind the fool or jester at court. Abbot Mark Patrick writes of the importance of the anamkara, roughly translated as spiritual friend, who will watch over your addictive tendencies and tell you the truth. Martin Donnelly, permanent secretary at BIS, defined a good leader as one who seeks counsel. And thank heavens for a free press, for the media too will prevent messianic tendencies. It is the willingness to listen to disagreement that will create the open mindset that makes seeing differently possible, seeing the things which we cannot now see. It should be noted that utilitarianism does not like this. Utilitarianism, which uses numbers to come to moral conclusions, likes certainties. You can only put a number against something that you know exists. If you have not yet seen it, you cannot count it. In this regard, Ian McGilchrist contrasts the Romantics favorably with the rationalist Kant and Bentham, father of utilitarianism. McGilchrist cites Wordsworth, one Romantic, who said, "Listening intently for the call of the owl, I hear the distant sound of mountain torrents." The Romantics took their walks in twilight, open to the mystery of nature and the universe. Kant and Bentham, by contrast, took their walks in full daylight and always at the same time of day, so reliably that people set their watches by them. Not together, of course. Abbot Mark Patrick suggests the Benedictine vow of obedience really means to listen, and Sister Joan Chichester says that this is to become an ear that pays attention to every single thing the universe is saying. Listening to disagreement makes you more likely to acknowledge that you do not, in the end, know. Returning to the desert is reconnecting with not knowing, out of which new perceptions can then arise. Mostly, though, we don't want to listen to disagreement because it is actually very hard to accept mutually incompatible moral claims or arguments that are simultaneously true and inconsistent with each other. But we need to be able to wait with paradox rather than reach too quickly for our benefit-cost ratio calculators. The film Of Gods and Men told the true story of a group of monks in Algeria at the time of the Civil War. Hitherto, the monks had lived in good harmony with their Muslim neighbors. Now they were threatened with extermination by extremists unless they left. Should they stay or should they go? They were, after all, providing important medical care to the villagers, and yet staying meant mortal danger. But when the question was put to the vote, the oldest monk said, "I don't know yet." His sacred stubbornness might be thought of as a luxury in a monastery where there is time, but those Algerian monks did not have much time. A tennis player has even less. I commend to you the Andy Murray principle of decision-making. The longer he left his decision about how to play his return shot as the ball was coming at him from his opponent, the better the decision would be, because the longer he left it, the more information he had about the trajectory of the ball, the position of his opponent, and any other contextual data that would be relevant to the success of his return move. Milliseconds made a difference. I had a kind of conversion experience some 2 years after coming here to set up the Institute. In those 2 years, I had immersed myself in the culture of public service and made friends with the people doing it. My conversion was to see a deep level of uncorruption around Parliament Square. The Institute, I saw, was not to be founded upon a narrative of crisis. Westminster and Whitehall were not all wrong, and its people were not all bad. But this perception has to be questioned. I have to be like Karl Popper's good scientist, one who will try to disprove her hypothesis, not, as is the tendency, to see data to support it wherever she looks. The first conversion opens our eyes to new realities, but then we only see those new realities. Only penicillin will prevent infection. Only coal and oil will give us energy. And I have indeed been finding that I only meet wonderfully uncorrupt public servants, and I only notice the institutional mechanisms that support uncorruption. So I made myself read How Corrupt is Britain by David White, who claims to demonstrate profound corruption at senior levels in the establishment. His method is to expose what he sees as the evil of neoliberal capitalism, and he says this: what we have been witnessing over the past 30 years has been the systematic erosion of this public realm as more and more of the public sector has been privatized, outsourced, or made subject to market principles. It is this process that has led to the long list of abuses catalogued in the book. Is it any wonder that ministers, civil servants, and military leaders should expect to use their office as a means of leveraging fat jobs in the private sector when those they rub shoulders with on a daily basis are doing the same in their own business sphere? David White has an agenda, but that does not make him wrong, and I hear him, though I really do not want to believe that the public servants I work with and the friends I have made would be so corrupt. I don't want to believe it of myself. The really valuable point is that we are all vulnerable to corruption, and no matter how relatively uncorrupt the system is, it is, and we are, never uncorruptible. My conversion to championing uncorruption in Parliament Square is tempered now by a recognition of the forces that corrode it. They are not just financial. Power has a corrosive force all of its own. A politician must first of all seek and retain power, must be selected, elected, and re-elected. Power is her fuel, and there is never enough to go around. She can only change the world if she has power, but seeking power will change her. Being in the public eye, essential to the politician seeking office, is also corrosive. Hannah Arendt goes so far as to assert that goodness cannot survive publicity. A person, she says, can be great or he can be good. He cannot be both. So let us now look at the question, what good should we be trying to do, through the prism of conversion of manners in some specific contexts around Parliament Square. Claire Moriarty, now Permanent Secretary at DEFRA, wrote some years ago about the inherent values conflict for the civil servant. Civil servants are, generally speaking, idealistic people with very deep and lasting public service values. Moriarty identifies these as a motivation to want to make the world a better place to live in, tempered by realism and guardianship of propriety. These values describe the good that civil servants believe they should do and are powerful motivators for their work. And yet, by the nature of the political system we have, and indeed in service to the democratic principle, civil servants must adopt and make work not their own values, but those of the minister whom they serve, without necessarily sharing or even understanding them. Moriarty writes, "Some core values appear to be shared. Idealism is a strong value for politicians as it is for civil servants. But for a party politician, it is perhaps axiomatic that the world will be a better place to live in if their party is in government and therefore able to implement the policies to which it is committed. Civil servants," she goes on to say, "don't aspire to be politicians. We would be in the wrong job if we did. That much is contained in the fundamental tenet of civil service neutrality. So we clearly shouldn't be internalizing political value systems, but we effectively have to live by them. The oddity in the civil service deal is not that political values prevail, but that of everyone in a government department, only ministers and their special advisors are expected to subscribe to those values. And the fear of compromising political neutrality means that there is little incentive to understand the political value system, and indeed some subtle discouragement from doing so. This inherent conflict of values keeps the civil servant in a state of continued questioning, and at its best allows him to remain open in precisely the way I have been arguing conversion of manners means. But it is important he understands the moral conflict is inherent and arguably healthy. Otherwise, he may think his discomfort implies there is something wrong. This will affect leadership in the civil service because values are so vital to the motivation and uncorrupt behavior of the civil servant. Here is what it looks like from the other side, the side of the politician. Gerald Kaufman writes in his book, How to Be a Minister. What Whitehall does believe in, for better or worse, is continuity. It is not, do I agree with it, but can I make it work? The civil servants may not agree with you politically, but they really do have a sense of loyalty to their ministers. He adds, it is very easy and rather unpleasant to have rows with people who, in the nature of things, cannot answer you back. So if you're looking for ideas for legislation, Kaufman says, do not then turn to your civil servants, but to your party's election programme. He details the navigation of your party's ideas from manifesto through legislation to policy implementation via the civil service system, through Parliament, without antagonising MPs who have to defend you locally, or the National Party membership, and then back to the civil service machine again. The journey is complex and exhausting, and at every step of the way, compromising adjustments have to be made to ensure the safe passage of your bill. But you must attend to these different constituencies or suffer the misery that they will make of your life. And you must never forget that you and your party will need to be re-elected. If you do not have power, you do not have anything. At their best, the navigation challenges for the politician demand that she attend to different views, and her conversion of manners is sustained by constant reference to her communities. But the challenges will also whittle away at her good intentions and the good intentions of her policies. She is in danger of acting only as a people pleaser and not as a leader. The power she must always attend to retaining will corrode her aim to make the world a better place unless she consciously takes steps to protect herself. Let us look at one final area of moral dilemma in public life, which I can't resist because of the presence of my distinguished chair, that of being a police officer and that of running a police force. The London Policing Ethics Panel, chaired by the formidably analytical Lord Carlisle, published a report entitled Ethical Challenges of Policing in London, in which the following observation was made. Because they hold public authority, the public tends to expect police officers to be exemplars of morality. That is, the public expects the police to be ethically better than the rest of us. Yet we have also seen that police officers must regularly make quick judgments in applying abstract concepts to challenging situations. The police will face more ethical dilemmas than most of us, where something bad will unavoidably happen. And when they make mistakes, these will often have larger than normal impacts on people's lives. So the very people who we expect to be ethically better than us will in fact do more things that are harmful and wrong, just because that is the nature of their job. Police officers have to respond, often very quickly, to extremely complicated situations where the moral issues at stake are manifold and conflicting. A moral philosopher can take a lifetime to unpick the dilemmas. A police officer has to act fast to limit damage and bring criminals to justice. Called to a potential crime scene, she will need speedily to weigh in the balance any combination of any number of drug or alcohol addiction, sexual, emotional or physical abuse, familial neglect, poverty, bad housing, bad schooling, and mental illness. The Andy Murray approach to decision-making applies. Make your decision and act decisively, but make it as late as is safely possible. For the one running a police force, the competing moral imperatives are also manifold. Criminals must be brought to justice, but the process of doing so must be fair. The moral imperative is that no one should be condemned without fair trial. At the same time, victims must be confident that if they come forward to speak, they will be heard. There is a fraught hinterland here, particularly in the world of abuse, born of attitudes and beliefs about women and children in particular, that they are not to be trusted and believed, that they don't believe they will be trusted and believed, and that the relationships within which abuse takes place are such that they don't know if they even believe themselves. The victim can harbor devastating feelings of responsibility for the wrong that has been done, confusing the case and making clarity and truth that much harder to reach. There can be a crazy notion in the victim's mind of needing to protect the abuser. The knowledge of deep down, hidden, shameful memories that any of us who have taken the time for therapy or confession know about, hidden and suppressed and doubted, confound truth. There is a moral imperative owed to victims and to truth itself to work hard to find the reality of the situation. There is the moral imperative not to act on the word of someone who has made false accusation. In the midst of the clouds of uncertainty that beset the victim's situation, how is the false accusation to be weeded out? And yet it must be, because it is also a moral imperative to avoid damage to the falsely accused. There is the moral imperative for forgiveness and reconciliation, vital to the health of people who must be able to move on. Those who harbor bitterness and resentment and cannot lay them to rest become warped in their perceptions and lost to society, because until the hurt is addressed, they cannot be of service to others. To whom are apologies owed? When are apologies morally demanded? Do too many of them devalue the currency? Righteous indignation on behalf of others is easy, much easier than righteous indignation on our own behalves. But perhaps that's why we should have it, to defend each other, to protect each other's reputations if we are diffident about defending our own. Bernard Hogan-Howe acknowledged the moral force of these different positions and the tension that lies between them in a recent article in The Guardian, in my view demonstrating the right kind of leadership. He wrote about facing the paradox, not choosing too soon, acknowledging the force of the argument on both sides, not caving in to interest-based pressure, wherever it comes from, and, most of all, having the strength to hold the tension of the competing moral imperatives rather than close the case too soon. What is the good we should be trying to do is answered by the Benedictine virtue conversion of manners as openness, not only to the great paradigm shifts, the great conversions to new perceptions and beliefs, but a daily openness to counterfactuals, to apparently opposing truths, to the data that don't demonstrate the truth of your hypotheses. Conversion of manners is cultivating a character that can withstand corrosion but remains open to difference. It is growing the strength and courage to wait with contradiction until it is necessary to decide and act. Vernon's lecture a fortnight ago described the constancy and flux at the heart of true stability. Andrew's lecture on community emphasized that we are in this together. Both acknowledged their theological inspiration, as I do now. I believe, not because I think I should, but rather as a matter of disposition, that the reason we can and should look for what we cannot now see and wait with fortitude in the face of paradox and inconsistency, not for solutions, but rather for clarity about the next step towards wholeness, is that there is wholeness. I am, then, in sympathy with this poem by another great figure from the 5th century, Boethius, which encourages you, like Sir Bernard, to hold fast to what you feel to be true and always listen for more. This discord in the packs of things, this endless war twixt truth and truth, that singly hold, yet give the lie to him who seeks to yoke them both. And therefore, whoso seeks the truth shall find in no wise peace of heart, for neither does he wholly know, and neither doth he all forget. But that high thing which once he saw and still remembers, that he holds, and seeks to bring the truth forgot again to that which he has yet. The best conversion story I've heard recently is true. A tourist from China approached one of our beadles, these are our security guards, and said he'd been in the Abbey and he'd seen a statue of Mary. So was the Abbey Catholic? And the beadle replied, it was Catholic until 1531, and then it became Anglican. And then he watched this tourist go to his wife and say to his wife very carefully, the Abbey is Catholic until 3:30, and then it becomes Anglican. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gents, I'm sure that you will agree a fantastic tour and a comprehensive account of a very complex subject and the sort of speech that makes you think for a long time afterwards. But of course, you've got a few minutes to reflect and perhaps consider a few questions. Claire, you intrigued me, not particularly the part that referred to the police and myself, but you left me thinking, was it ever possible for a politician to decide whether to be elected or be good? And I don't know exactly what made me think that, and I don't know if there are any politicians in the audience, but I think it must be a dilemma for them.
I think anyone who, well, pretty much anyone who goes into politics has among their motives the desire to make the world a better place. There will be, as with all of us, there are other motives, but there will be that motive. And then the task is not to forget that motive, but it's hard. Because if you don't have power, you can't do your job, so you must seek power, and that is corrosive.
Do you think they have to compromise along the way at all? Do they have to be, let's say, do they have to sometimes be bad to be elected?
Compromise, certainly, and compromise is not a bad thing. One of the great things that politics teaches us is that we're all in this together. A politician can't operate independently. He or she needs their party, they need their constituents, they need that which gives them the power to make the changes they want to. So the changes they want to have to adapt. That's the nature of the democratic system that we have, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, you might think you know what the good thing is that you should be doing, but you're probably not completely right. And if it weren't for the fact that you have to consult, operate within a community, respond to that community, you'd probably go herring off in a dictator fashion, thinking it was for the best of all, and it really probably wasn't. This balance of power that we have around Parliament Square is very important for retaining something that's not purely good, but then what does pure goodness mean? Has anyone ever seen it on earth? The compromise can be very good indeed, but I think it's also always a temptation for a politician in particular, a democratically elected politician, that pleasing people in the end becomes all that your job is about, and that's not good morally. I'm not going to say bad. Bad is a strong word, but you can find this corrosive force has got at you without you realizing it. That's really why I keep speaking about the importance of company, of having your devil's advocate, of having the people who are going to tell you that you're going wrong, because you won't necessarily know it yourself.
Okay. Gentleman at the back.
Oh.
Peter Bottomley, I'm Parliamentary Warden at St Margaret's and also a Member of Parliament. Can I move people from politics to monastic orders in two steps? The first is to point out that members of Parliament have far more freedom and are far less under an obligation of obedience than local councillors are, or people in the armed services or the civil service, or even the police, I guess. On the conversion of manors, did it have a clearer meaning 15 centuries ago? Would it have needed explaining the way you've explained it to us now? And how do the other orders do without having that as one of their first three things?
There will be scholars who can answer that question properly, and I certainly can't. I'm not a scholar of Benedictine history or monasticism. It is interesting that the Benedictine order has this vow and the others don't. Benedictines don't, for example, vow celibacy, interestingly, given the story I began with. But they would understand conversion of manors to include that. I can only really speak about the Benedictines I know today and how they understand that vow, which they still take. And it is a commitment to the monastic life which is remade. And that was the sense in which I wanted to use it for us today. But I was playing fast and loose with the virtue, if I may say so, in order to make it work for us today. That was my approach. I wasn't really thinking of you as a monk, Peter. I was thinking of you as a politician striving to be good, striving not to be corroded by these corrupting forces of power, and how it can help you and all public servants in their work.
Gentleman here.
Neil Bassart, Yemen Usher, House of Lords. Claire, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed that and agree with just about everything you said in it. I'm reading John Ronson's book, The Psychopath Test, at the moment, and it occurs to me to what extent, I'm not claiming for an instant that people in power around Whitehall are in any way psychopaths. But it does occur to me, to what extent do you think character interplays with the virtue of manners?
I think it's essential. Morality can be thought of as applying a set of rules, or it can be good principles, like beneficence. Or it can be thought of as making a calculation, utilitarian calculation. So very simply, if more people are made happy by your action than are made sad, then your action is right. If more people are made sad by your action than made happy, or experience pain rather than pleasure, then your action is bad. And there's no tragedy in that. You simply do the mathematical calculation and act accordingly. But these approaches don't take any account of our humanity, what it is that we bring to the moral calculation or the application of the principle. We are absolutely affected by our context. We're absolutely affected by the things that made us who we are, and that's going to determine how we apply those principles or how we make those calculations. So if we don't attend to character, our morality is going to be, formulaic, but it's going to be applied in ways that we're not even aware of the biases that would appear in those applications. So character is essential. We've probably all got a bit of psychopath in us, probably.
Anybody prepared to confess? No? Lady there.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. My name's Theodora Clark. I was just reflecting on the American election and watching coverage of recent debates, and you'll notice how every candidate always finishes a speech or a stump by saying, "God bless America." And it's very much kind of an integral part of their campaigning and public life. And it strikes me that in the UK, we've kind of moved away from that over the last few centuries. So you are absolutely opposite the House of Commons. How important do you think faith is to Parliament today?
Very, but I don't see that. I would hate it if our politicians started saying, "God bless Britain." I think, and I speak as a religious person, I find it utterly toe-curling because it's lassoing God. And commanding God and bringing God into a realm that is much, much smaller than God. What I think is the extraordinary opportunity of the geographical reality of Westminster Abbey on one side of Parliament Square, with the legislature, the executive and the judiciary on the other three sides of the square, is that it calls the Abbey to think about what it is doing for public service. That's the way I think of it. Not these guys around here should be thinking about God more, but what should we, in this extraordinary place, look at it, and with this extraordinary, rich treasury history of reflection and contemplation and deep thought, how can that be brought to serve those who serve the public? And that's what the Institute is trying to do. So if I can understand faith in public life like that, then I absolutely think it should be there.
Gentleman here.
Ryan Gillon, singing partners and long-time sparring partners in medical ethics. I was slightly worried by your notion of the Andy Murray approach to ethical decision-making, the last minute possible. It seemed to me that sometimes one is required to make decisions at the last second, but in general, it seems far better to make the decisions over a period of time if you can. And I wondered how you would respond to that worry, especially in the context of long reflection in the Benedictine tradition.
Yes. Well, the actual decision and the actual action is right at the last minute, isn't it? The pondering, the consideration, this is the point, should go on for as long as possible. There was a piece on the Today programme this morning. There's a business school in the States, Wilton Business School, which is commending procrastination and playing solitaire when you should be writing your thesis, but never finishing things too soon, using the deadline because there's more creativity allowed. But the decision itself surely should be made as late as possible, because you have far more information at the end of your time than you do halfway through, including your own mental considerations and your consultation of others and your listening to others.
Okay, Stephen.
Claire, thank you very much for your address. I have a problem that I want to share with you, which is a sense of tension. And the tension is between, just going back to the last question, the tension is on the one hand between the Andy Murray, let's take a decision at the last possible moment, milliseconds or otherwise, and the issue of leadership. And you talked yourself in your address about the difficulties, for example, for the police service. If you think about something which we're going to be commemorating in the Abbey shortly, the centenary of the Battle of the Somme, when you had, I imagine, constant incidents, episodes of leadership by officers leading their men into what was an impossibly awful and uncertain time as they got out of their own particular part of the line and moved forward towards the Germans. It just seems to me that there's a tension between leaving it to the last minute and actually exercising that degree of ability, of judgment, of decision-making at the outset, which actually gets others to follow you when they themselves need someone to tell them what to do and when to do it.
So if the decision needs to be made, you make the decision when the decision needs to be made. If there's work to be done in consulting on it, communicating it, following it up, then you make the decision then. I'm not suggesting that we do nothing. Oh my God, what do we do now? That's not at all what Andy Murray does. What he does is he's calculating, he's looking at this ball coming towards him, and a million different bits of data are making their way into his brain, and then he says, right, I'll do that. But it's not that nothing's happened before that moment. And that, for Andy Murray, is the right moment to make the decision. But if you've got to do things with that decision, then you make it before you have to do things with that decision. The point is, don't make it early. Certainly don't make it thinking, oh God, I've got to make a decision. And the fact that there are these competing moral claims that don't sit together means that I'll simply ignore those and go with those, which is our tendency. It's much easier to do that. What I'm suggesting is, if there is that competing moral claim, sit with it. Don't anxiously dismiss the bits that don't fit and move, but sit with it. If you can. If you can't, then you have to decide as best you can. Andy Murray doesn't have much time. The police officer entering a scene of crime has absolutely no time. But nevertheless, take in as much as you can before making the move.
But to be a leader, you may have to decide before you know all the dimensions.
You always have to decide before you know all the damage. So you decide as late as possible, when you know as much as you possibly can know. I hope that's clear. I'm not at all suggesting that we do nothing, and then suddenly splat. Not at all. But make the decision as late as you possibly can.
Okay. I think Helen at the back.
Hello, Helen Bailey. Thank you very much for your lecture. I was much heartened by your finding of uncorruption around this square and in public service. I'm a great advocate for it. But it struck me that if I was to be simplistic, the notions that you gave us of the abysses into which we might fall fell at the sort of interaction of politics and public service, or public and private sector. And it seemed to me that there was another one, which is our own sort of sense of justification in being in public service in the first place, which might of itself be just as much as a trap as either of those. I wondered if you wanted to offer some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I spoke of the corrosive power of finance, of power itself, and there was a third one, which was publicity, being in the public eye or seeking publicity. And in a way that, apart from financial, those other two are really related to the people who have to seek power, namely elected MPs only. But you're quite right, there's also a corrosive power or effect of those who are in public service, who have a position which is respected, which carries with it considerable influence, which can corrode the character. So civil servants are not exempt from the corrosive forces that can affect your character.
Neither are colleagues in the private sector necessarily bad people.
And neither people in the private sector are necessarily bad people. It was a very simplistic thesis this chap had. I'm bound to say I was rather disappointed. I was hoping to be better persuaded. But he did seem to assume that if you were making money, you must be bad. I don't know about this interaction between public and private. It's an ongoing debate. It's certainly something to be careful about, but it's not the only thing to be careful about in terms of the character of the public servant.
Claire, I've identified two final questions, if that's okay.
Yes.
Gentleman here, I think the woman here.
I think part of the discomfort about the time dimension might be, how do you deal with the old, there must perhaps be some wisdom behind a stitch in time saves 9. So is there a tragic dimension along the timeline that you also need to sit with, that says, ideally, I would like to wait, but I know that if I wait, then I might end up with more of a deterioration. And I feel that maybe people feel that that tragic dimension of the timeline is perhaps missing. And then I just had a thought on the money thing. There's a sense in which the complaint about money in politics and the sense that something has changed is the sense that money has become compulsory, in a sense that these spheres of different values have collapsed into a common denominator, so that there's less to sit with if profit values are unable to impinge on what was not there, render under Caesar. So those two thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So a stitch in time saves 9 is a very good, cautious way to live, and it's not wrong. This is a matter of judgment when one takes that stitch or when one waits. When you make the decision, yes. But one should never do it out of fear. Care, yes, but not fear. And then the second point is, are we really thinking here about everything is monetized? And if it's not monetized, it doesn't have any value, or its only value is in its monetizing, and that's a kind of flattening of everything. Is that really the point? Yes. Well, I agree. It's a problem. Okay. It really is a problem.
I find a question, the woman here.
Thank you. Margaret Haig from the Intellectual Property Office. I'm a civil servant. I think you might be onto something in management speak. I think instead of blue sky thinking, we should have desert thinking. But actually, on a serious note, I think finding that that challenge, that accurate challenge and disagreement and dissent is really important. And one of the lessons I found really useful in my short career so far is that if you make a policy decision and everyone is angry with you, it's probably about right. So, so far I have found that helpful. But I think finding that desert space, and I think that I just wanted to link it back to what you were saying about what can Westminster Abbey offer, and what can religion and faith offer, and it is actually providing that desert space, that contemplative space in which to challenge things. I've been incredibly challenged by what we've heard today, and this kind of arguing against the current thought that we have is really important, and I think that is what faith and religion can actually offer.
Thank you. We'll try.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gents, just falls to me now to just to close this evening. First of all, I'm sure that you would join me eventually in saying thank you to Claire. I think particularly because the richness of what she discussed, based from a historical perspective, but equally very live and real today. She brought home to me something that you may have thought about before, but I hadn't, the four squares of the four sides of this square here, and whether it be the law, government, parliament, and obviously the church, and how they are represented around this square, and how sometimes they challenge each other, all trying to do the same thing, I suspect, which is good, but not always easy to determine what is good, and not always easy to determine for anybody involved in any of those four aspects which way they should travel. Should they travel to please? Should they travel for some moral imperative? Is money a good measure? And sometimes it may be, but not always. So I thought Claire brought to us a great richness of debate, and I think one of the great tests, as I said earlier, of a good lecture is whether or not it makes you think, and whether it makes you think for a long time, not only the thoughts you have immediately. But can I thank all the people who asked questions, and I thought the richness of the questions displayed the quality of the lecture. And can you join in me in thanking Claire not only for tonight, but clearly all the preparation that went into getting her here tonight to deliver such a high quality speech, which I think served us very, very well. Thank you.